We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
Looks like the rain has gone.
Hey everybody, it's Boysen Hodgson. Welcome back to the Mankind Podcast, the podcast where we are setting out to prove that there is indeed more than one way to be a man. So today I have the honor of meeting for the first time in a real setting somebody who I have known about for probably 14 years or so through the work of the Mankind Project, Jo Langford. So Jo, first of all, just say hey.
Hey, everybody. Happy to be here.
Jo reached out to me a little bit ago because he has just gone through the third revision of a book, and we're going to jump into it. But if you are parent of a teen, if you have anything to do with teens, if you're interested in sexuality, if you're interested in how we have big, deep conversations, if you are interested in what's happening in the world around post-pandemic with young people, Jo Langford is a dad. He's a master's level therapist and sex educator for tweens, teens, and parents in Seattle, Washington. For 20 years, he's been working at the intersection of adolescence, technology, and sexuality. So Jo is the author of the Spare Me, the Talk series, which started out as a book for boys, then was a book for girls, guides to sex and relationship and growing up for modern teens and their parents. His latest book is called The Pride Guide, which is an encompassing guide to sexual and social development, safety, and health for queer youth and families. So, Jo Langford, welcome to the Mankind Podcast. I feel honored to be here with you today and have this talk. We're going to have the talk right here. So I think
I'm super excited to be here.
Good. I think the first thing where I want to start is in our pre-conversation, we started to touch on the fact that you have basically been doing work with teens since you were a teen yourself. So let's start there. When did you start getting interested in this?
Well, I went to a pretty cool and progressive at the time private high school, and there was a handful of us. They created a peer outreach program there, and so there were a few master's level therapists that did like legit supervision with us. And I think there were 6 of us in the program. And so we had some training, and then if a kid didn't want to talk to a grown-up, they could talk to us. And, we got this like direct supervision from these grown-ups that knew what they were doing. And it really just kind of put me on a path and made me think I could change the world and make it better. I've always been a person that people kind of told their shit and their secrets to. And so it's just kind of a nice thing. So, and then I've worked in hospitals, I've worked in foster care system, I've worked in group homes, I've had my own private practice for a while. So yeah, I've like literally been working with teenagers since I was one.
Going back to that period of time, way back when, what was it about? What was it about working? Well, what'd you learn? What did you learn as a teen doing peer counseling with other teens?
What have I learned? The big learning I think at the time that still sort of sneaks up on me every once in a while is that like kids just want to be talked to like human people. Like they don't necessarily want to be talked to like kids, or you got like, well, how do you talk to teens? Like you can just talk to them like they're made of human parts, like everybody else, and they tend to kind of respect and respond to that. They can tell if you're sort of trying to like talk at them or down to them, kind of thing.
Teens have pretty good bullshit bullshit meters.
Some of the best, yeah.
Some of the best. So the first book, Spare Me the Talk, that you wrote for boys, let's talk about that. And that was 2015, I think you said.
Yeah, there was kind of a primordial version of it with a small publisher out of Arizona that was around for 15 minutes, and then I kind of morphed that into what became Spare Me the Talk. But yeah, I'm a teenager. I work with boys primarily. I work with adults and some girls too, but like most of my clients identify as like the boy flavor of teen, and so working with them and just kind of eternally sort of exasperated about the things that guys don't know or don't understand. Everything from like why or how to use condoms to like jokes and language and misogyny and like all that kind of stuff. And especially when I had my period of life where I was working in the group home, and just kind of really a sense of kind of sort of reorganizing and re-raising some of these boys and teaching them things that like they never learned from parents for whatever reason. And so, at some point I kind of was like tired of getting there after something terrible hit the fan and wanted to be more proactive. And so I kind of turned my energies into doing this book, which at the time was the only book in print that was like a puberty, health, sexuality book written specifically for boys. There wasn't anything like it. Now there's a couple out there, but at the time there wasn't anything. So it was an outlier and a really, I think, kind of necessarily like a needed thing at the time.
And what are a few of the big pieces that you thought, like, I've been aware of our bodies ourselves, right? Since I was a teenager. What do you think
Right.
it is that's different about boy bodies and boy flavored teens that you spoke to? What is it that you wanted to get across by writing a specific boy book?
There's so much stuff, like primarily a lot just about, bodies and development and sexuality. And, there's just sort of like a tone that we have that I think we probably got from the generation before us in the 80s and the 90s. Like, girl bodies are complicated and there's lots of things happening, and boys will just sort of figure it out in the shower. And then we don't really have to talk to them about anything, right? But there's everything, right? Like, everything from kids, doing that thing like I was masturbating one day and then all of a sudden stuff came out and I thought I broke it. I thought I was dying and I didn't know what was happening, to how and why to use condoms and all the feelings that come along with adolescence as well. And we just don't really talk to our boys about that very much. So kind of wanting to give them a heads up, like these are the things that are going to happen to you and this is how you can handle it, and it doesn't make you weird or crazy even though you'll feel weird and crazy. That kind of stuff was a big part of it. And then porn, right? Like the I spend a ridiculous amount of time in my work week talking and thinking about pornography.
That is exactly where I was going to go next, and you brought it into the conversation before I did. So even in 2015, right? This was already the world of digital natives. This was already the world of kids who were raised with devices, raised with internet, raised with all of that stuff. How disconnected do you think parents are from the reality of pornography in their teens' lives?
Well, it's not as bad as it used to be, but I think most parents are still pretty disconnected when it comes to their kids specifically. So I've worked with kids for a long time, and I kind of worked through the whole like millennial generation, and those kids just got royally screwed, right? They were the first ones that kind of came of age with internet access, but their parents
Didn't know.
had no idea still kind of don't like what was going on, right? Whereas, I'm making an age generalization with you, but I think like you and I, like we're pretty solidly sort of Gen X, and so we get to see all those like Millennium kids that came up behind us, and they just went bananas, and lots of terrible things happened from like porn stuff and sexual assault and misogyny and being charged for crimes for sending pictures of your penis to people that didn't ask to see it. All kinds of crap happened. And so now, like, we can do better for Gen Z, right? Um, and I think most people are on board with that. Uh, and I think it has gotten better. But I think when, thinking about our kids as sexual creatures makes a lot of people uncomfortable. Even parents who do have some kind of relationship with porn, they don't tend to talk about it with their kids very much. And what happens most often, I think, is they kind of assume that it's going to be for their kids the way it was for them. And it's not, right? It's like a totally different creature than it was when we were our kids' ages.
This may be hard. This may be difficult. Warnings to listeners. I'm going to start asking hard questions. So what you didn't see, if you're just listening to the podcast, is Joe's body language when he said, tend to think that it was like it was for them, but it's not, with two hands up in front of the screen. How is it not the same as it was when you and I, so yes, Gen X here, I'm a Gen Xer, you're a Gen Xer. I think I'm older than you, but whatever. How is it different today? And feel free to yeah.
I've had, like I said, I spend a crazy amount of time talking about this stuff during my work week. It's just right now, it's just everywhere, right? It's a constantly available tab. Like anybody can find it anytime. There could be somebody listening to this podcast right now who's also looking at porn on a different screen. Like it's just at your fingertips 24/7. The average age at which kids find the porn is like 9 or 10 now, right? And I think in like early 90s, it was like 15 or 16, which still for some may be too young to be looking at porn, but at least like they're in active puberty, right? So what we have now is this constantly available stream. It's not just like airbrushed photos with strategically placed ice cream cones in a pull out of a magazine, or like slowly downloaded videos from dial-up internet. It's just everything, like things like most people don't even think of in their regular day. It's just right there in HD in their kids' faces. And for a lot of kids that I work with, they can spend, a year, 2 years, sometimes 3 years looking at porn before they even get their first pubic hair, right? Before puberty even hits. What does that do to your brain, right? So I spend a lot of time kind of helping kids sort of unlearn the things that they get from porn. Kids aren't stupid, but they're not, running on a fully functional hard drive yet. And they can say, I play Grand Theft Auto all the time, but that doesn't, they understand they don't know how to drive a car, right? But they do think they know how to do the sex because of all the porn they've seen. That for some reason, they don't necessarily understand that is also fiction, right?
I think that was an excellent analogy. Grand Theft Auto, I don't think because I've played Grand Theft Auto that I know how to drive a car, but somehow this has a different impact on me. So what are the kind of, and I'm going to use therapy speak, what are the kind of cognitive distortions that you see teen boys ending up with because of this enculturation?
It's a lot of pressure, I think. Like it's very performative. And so, there's things they think that they are supposed to be saying to people during sex because they hear it in the videos. there's positions that they're supposed to be in or ask someone else to be in. They don't understand that like most people don't do three or four of those things that were you just saw in that video. And if they do them, they don't do them in the order that you saw them in. Like
Right.
there's things that have to happen, and there's um, and so they just don't, they're not able to extrapolate what they see into real life, especially if they do end up in a situation where they're like naked in a room with somebody for the first time, because they're not, they're panicking, they're stressed out, they're nervous, they're not like even thinking logically. But then they do remember, like, oh, women particularly like to be called like this name and that name. And then they're kind of shocked and surprised sometimes when they're not very appreciative of being called those names, especially in a vulnerable moment, right?
They don't want to. And that immediately kind of jumps me to, okay, so now flip side of that, how do you see young women, girls and young women being enculturated into the same stuff? And do you have any information or ideas about like parity between boys and girls in terms of who's watching porn and what they're watching and how much?
I think girls definitely watch porn as well. I don't think it is in the same way that boys do. It's not as much as boys do. Um, but when girls watch it, lots of times it's kind of like to sort of check it out of curiosity. They're often like it's like a dare or a joke. They're laughing. But they can definitely like I don't know, like a lot of the girls that I've worked with in the last decade, right? They can say, I can totally tell the guys who learned how to have sex by watching porn from the guys that don't. Like, they're more aggressive, they're more like directive, they're more let's go right now, right? Like that pizza was delivered, so let's get on with it kind of thing. There's no flirting, there's no relationship buildup. Um, they say it's just a bunch of guys who are into some weird sexual stuff, and then even when you do it, they don't call you afterwards, that kind of thing. So yeah, that the pornographic template, I think, is if you're an adult and you have a sense of yourself as a sexual creature and you have a sex life that you have developed, and then you look at porn every once in a while, like that's not going to mess you up, right? But when we have kids who are kind of starting at blank slates, and they are using it more as a roadmap of how to do the stuff, and it's just bad, even from a just like a self-esteem kind of thing. This pressure that guys say about like, if I'm not rock hard and ready to have sex with anyone who is in proximity to me at every single moment of every single day, like then something's wrong with me. Um, and that's just not the way reality works, but it is in the movies. And so they think, the idea of a flaccid penis, they just never see it, right? And if there's is, even if they're sitting in math class, but they're sitting next to the hot kid next to them, then they think something's wrong with me.
And yeah, and yes. How about body image stuff? So you're kind of touching on that for boys, but yeah, dad, as a teen, dad of teens, I have also witnessed a whole lot of like really distorted negative body image stuff around this.
Yeah, I think, well, gosh, I can go on and on about that. I don't want to bore anybody, but I mean, you know, uh, the not only with porn, but like the rise of like, Instagram influencers and things like that. Like, I have a lot of teenage boys in my orbit, both clients and like in my personal life, and they spend ridiculous amounts of time at the gym. They're measuring their food. They're, talking about how much protein they're eating, and like this idea of the washboard abs, the 3% body fat. Like it's when we think of body image influenced by media, like a lot of people just kind of default to thinking about its impact on women, which is significant and important, but it does impact the boys too. Um, a couple of weird ways that I think this happens. Like I've had I don't know how many, what is it, July, August almost.
Hmm.
I've had probably four clients this calendar year so far that I've had to kind of talk out of this idea that they have gotten, mostly because they've been looking at porn since before they were in puberty, that if my penis is hard, I have to do something about it, right? Like the idea, like, oh, I have an erection in math class. I'm just gonna like strategically hold my books over here, not stand up at the board, and like give it a few minutes and it'll go away. And they're just like, oh, I have to go run to the bathroom and mix a batch because my penis got hard. And I'm like, how many times a day does this happen to you? Like this is for most guys, like this is a thing that happens a few times a day. And but this idea that they get in their head, and it's weird because it's happened multiple times. So I don't know like where they're getting that concept from, but literally they're like, oh, my penis is hard, I have to go take care of it, right? I'm like, no, you don't. Just give it a minute. It'll be fine. Trust me. And that is just like their whole world just goes like sideways. It's never occurred to them. And the other interesting thing that I've been dealing with, and I've been dealing with this for a while, this got to do something about my erection thing. It feels kind of newish, um, but uh, but the pubic hair is a whole thing. Like parents, we have to talk to our kids about pubic hair now. Like we didn't. I don't know if that's ever happened before generationally, but it's a thing to talk about because and I think it's a direct influence of porn
Right.
because in mainstream, especially heterosexual porn, like everyone is shaved like the day they got here, and 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 so kids are doing that too, right? Like I've had kids who've like never seen an adult body with pubic hair before. Um, and if you have time, I could tell a sad story. But I had a client who was he was probably 11, not quite 12 at the time, and he was getting a bunch of infections in his swimsuit
Wow.
area, and it took his parents a while to figure it out. They were working with his doctor, and then we figured out that he was just plucking his pubic hairs out as soon as they were growing in, because he felt weird and he felt gross. He said he felt dirty. He had no concept of why it was there, and so I started asking other clients, and it's a thing. I started asking pediatricians and other therapists. I was going around to like groups of kids and doing anonymous questions like on cards, right? Just said,
Yeah.
how old are you? What do you do with your pubic hair? And the vast majority of kids are at least trimming the hedges if they're not kind of raising the whole yard. With the only exception of like kids who kind of fall into like the developmentally like delayed categories, like those kids seem to not be really doing much, but most everyone else, including girls, are doing some pretty significant trimming of the bushes. And yeah, it's crazy. I had one kid come up to me after one of those groups and kind of, just sort of yank on my coat sleeve, and he said, I don't totally understand what you're asking. He's like, do you mean like, do I wash it down the drain? Do I keep it in a jar in my desk? Like, what are you wanting to know? Like he was 17 and he didn't even understand. Like the question was, do you shave your pubic hair? Because I think the way I worded it was like, what do you do with your pubic hair, right? He was like, you mean, what do I do with it after I shave it? Like, whether you shaved it or not wasn't even in his consciousness. That was a given, right? It's just, it's amazing. So, and if people want to do that, I think that's fine. I think it's just the feeling like I have to do that or I'm weird. And if you're gonna do that, like you need to understand how to do that, because 13-year-olds blade shaving down there can end really, really badly, right? So,
Yeah.
so you know, just saying about like if you're gonna do stuff to your pubic hair, this is how to do it. And by the way, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. There's lots of examples, but so sorry, I'm going on and on, but I have a weird job.
You have a weird job, and there's just like a wait, what? That about
Yes.
this conversation, right? That I imagine is probably the reaction you get from a lot of parents which is like, oh, wait a minute, what? Yeah, hadn't ever thought of that. And wow,
Who would, right? Like who knew we had to think about that? But yeah, we do. It's a good conversation to have with your kids. Awkward,
awkward.
but important.
Let's. So on the flip side of this, we've spent some time talking. Something that I see out in pop culture, especially in hip hop culture these days, is that there has been some shift in body image stuff for women around weight, especially around shape and weight. Do you see that playing out with younger women in your practice?
I do, and in my personal life as well. Like I've got nieces, and I've got like teenage girls on my orbit as well, and I so I think there's a consciousness about it that is really healthy and accepting and understanding. Like I've got a daughter, and we watch movies and stuff like that, and like old movies, just especially in quarantine, right? We watched a bunch of movies and stuff, and and how often comments about people's bodies came up in movies in ways that like a lot of us didn't even really notice in the 80s and 90s,
Right.
and that they are just incensed by it, right? Like you just don't talk about people's bodies like that, and that it's okay to be whatever shape you are intellectually. They seem to really understand that and accept that. When they are alone in their rooms and thinking about things, it's a different story. Like the lens that they are able to use with themselves versus the lens they use with other women in their world, are seem to me to still be pretty, unfortunately, very different lenses. There's still a lot of self-esteem stuff with girls that's up.
That fits with my experience of, yes, fits with my experience as a dad also, that so I've been talking as a Gen Xer about the double life that I developed as a teenager around, and this was like a long time ago, right? Around porn. How do you think that idea of double life of teenagers is different or the same, or how is that playing out today?
I think the energy of it is probably the same, because I think, parents and kids just don't really talk seamlessly about this stuff. Like both sides of that continuum kind of come at that conversation with some baggage, and that I think mostly is culturally added in. So I think that kind of necessarily sort of creates this double life that you called it, right? And then even like the way that we hold that kind of stuff in the world now leans itself anyway to a double life. Like most people have a double life. Like
Yeah.
there's pictures that you have on your phone in that special folder that you only send to certain people in certain situations that are not in your regular camera roll. That kind of stuff is just pretty commonplace for a lot of people, Gen X all the way down. There's probably boomers that do that too, but I don't know. Um, so I think that idea of like this part of your life is like a separate thing. There's even a special place on your phone for it, that kind of thing. Leads to that mentality of like, this is something separate that I don't talk about with people.
So from this conversation, because I think we're going to transition a little bit, are there a few things that you would say to parents of teens right now who maybe are on the edge of this conversation, but a little hesitant to go there? What's a good way to start the conversation?
I think, you know, uh, looking for a third space is a really good way to do that,
Ooh,
right?
say more about
So,
that.
like, some parents will just sort of say, "Hey, what are you doing? Have you ever done this thing?" Right? And then that makes the kids want to light themselves on fire. Or they say, "When I was your age, this is what I did." And the kids are also like, "Please stop talking to me." Um, But if you can approach it in a different way, like, hey, I saw this thing, or I read this article about this kid who got in trouble with the thing and the stuff, or I know like this is a new phenomenon that's happening with like people shaving their pubic hair, and like would never even thought of that. Like, what do you think about that? Is this something you see in the locker room? Like, do your friends do this? That kind of thing where it's not necessarily talking about yourself or your specific kid, but this concept or other people. And that makes the conversation a lot more palatable, I think, for them.
Third,
Or a book, right? You could take a book and say, this guy Joe wrote this book, and in chapter whatever, he talked about whatever. What do
how,
you think about that?
that's great. How is the book laid out to help facilitate these things?
I think it is, I wrote it specifically on purpose to be sort of, you know, categorized into themes with short, little digestible chunks of information. So it's not necessarily like paragraph reading. And I think a lot of parents, all my books, I always have a section in the back that's just for the parents. But I have a lot of parents who use the book that way. So just kind of like leave the book out or say, hey, go read chapter whatever, and then let's go get some ice cream or go for a jog and let's talk. Yeah, but I've also had kids, sort of earmark or leave a bookmark in a certain section and just kind of accidentally leave the book on the coffee table. And so then the parents come and say, so why are you reading about blah, blah, blah? And trying to, encourage their parents to have a conversation, which I think is hilarious. That's happened like 3 times so far. And I think that's awesome. I didn't write it with the intention of that, but kids are kind of doing the reverse that I encourage the parents to do. And I think it's great.
So we, of course, will have links to the book and to Joe's website, Be Heroes, at the bottom of the podcast episode. But just so that we've got the reminder in there now, BeHeroes.net. Spare Me the Talk are the book titles, and the Pride Guide are the 3 books. So links in the underneath the thing. So I think we're going to transition a little bit to talk about some of the other big monumental changes that have happened in the world and with teens. We had this thing where for a year and a half, a lot of our kids got locked in the houses.
That thing, yes.
How are you seeing that play? I know how that played out in my world, and it was not very pretty a lot of the time. How is that playing out there?
It was rough. I think there were some positive things to it. I think that we, as a society and a world, I think we learned hopefully some things from it. Um, but I think the vast majority of people were kind of traumatized in a real way, and kids especially. I think, I think I don't want to say it. I think that the world is different now, and I think that they are different in the world. One of the big things that I've seen that, I do talks with parents and other professionals, and one thing that's come up over and over, especially in the last year, is like kids' development, because the physical development that kept going during quarantine, but all the social stuff, all the emotional stuff, that all stopped and hit pause, right? For a year and a half, like, which is significant, right? And so now when I'm talking to parents, I'm saying, you have a 15-year-old son, that's great. You have a 12-year-old daughter, that's awesome. But when you are thinking about them or their behavior, you need to understand that that 15-year-old boy, in a lot of ways, is still really 14, maybe 13 and a half. That 12-year-old daughter, she's going to show up in a lot of ways, a lot closer to 11 than 12. They will all get where they need to be. They'll all catch up to themselves eventually. But I think that we probably have another like year or two of those kids, who were like coming into adolescence and into puberty during quarantine, that they're going to need some time to catch up to themselves. Academically too, I think, even colleges are going to have to understand, like, oh, you were in middle school in 2020. Okay, this cohort is going to look different in college. than other cohorts. And I think
Yeah.
schools, for the most part, are doing a good job sort of navigating that. But as parents, I think we have to understand that too. Like you're a 19-year-old, there's a lot about them that's not 19. You know, you're a 16-year-old, there's a lot about them that is still 15. And we just need to kind of look at their behavior and go into these conversations, understanding that about them right now still. That's been the biggest thing.
I there's multiple things that I want to call out, but I want to just make note that you talked about a 15-year-old boy and a 12-year-old girl. Let's talk about just a little bit about developmental stages and ages, because I think that's something that I've seen. Are you familiar with Richard Reeves' new book of Boys and Men?
Oh yeah.
So
I haven't read it, but I've seen it.
he talks about that quite a bit in the book, about how as a society we've kind of stuffed boys and girls into the same box based on age, but that's just not so. It's just not something that developmentally is real. Talk a little bit about that. This is the therapist stepping forward.
Well, I think if I had more influence and I had it my way, I think even just like the way we school them would look very different. I think, you know, just the like sixth and seventh grade, okay, but like the difference between seventh grade and eighth grade is pretty significant. The difference between ninth grade and 10th grade is really significant. I would sort of have fifth, sixth, seventh grade. I'd have an eighth, ninth, uh, 10th grade, and then I have an 11th and 12th grade. Like I would separate them out. It's putting ninth graders in a school with 12th graders. Like there's so much differing developments going on. And then even putting like gender stuff in there as well,
Yeah.
like those are going to be different, just because they're both maybe 15 and a half. Like there's kids who identify differently amongst the genders, and those are all very different 15 and a half. And I think there's so much to say on that subject. But I, one of the things we do both in school but also just like in the media with social media, like they all have access to the same stuff,
Yeah.
and so they're getting the same influences, they're getting the same information, and for the most part I think that's fine. But it's different when a 13-year-old hears this thing and an 18-year-old hears this thing, even it's the same information. um, like if I could talk about my books again. Like I wrote them
Yeah.
in mind for like a kid who is just entering puberty, but also a kid who's going off to college. Like there's stuff in there that they might not have heard yet or heard about in a specific way, or coming at it from like a health standpoint. So that information is going to land on those two people in a very different way, even though it's the same information. But their developments are in such different places, right?
Yeah. Influencers, social influencers. You've tossed the word misogyny out a little bit, and you've also referenced the fact that it seems to me that some of the young women in our lives have a social consciousness that is pretty, at least verbally, pretty advanced around, yeah, we don't talk like that. We don't look at people that way. We don't make those kinds of judgments. There's a lot of stuff. Have you seen a lot of the negative influence of kind of, I don't want to use pejorative language around this. So there are influencers out there like Andrew Tate,
Oh, yeah.
for example. Can you talk about what you've seen out there for some of these hyper-masculine male influencers and how that hits our teen boys? The body language, again, is fascinating, folks. I just want you to just know
Sorry.
what's going on.
I can't hide anything on my face. I'm so bad about that. But it is exhausting to me. There's just so much of it, and I think I understand it from like a sociological point of view. I think that, you know, cisgendered dudes have been kind of steering the ship culturally for a really, really long time. And it's caused a lot of problems because they weren't kind of sharing the steering wheel with other people. And now I think more and more people are starting to call that idea out. Women are sort of speaking up for themselves and thinking about things in a different way. I think the Me Too movement was a great example of that. And I was talking to a group of boys a couple of weeks ago, and I was just saying, like it used to be embarrassing and shameful to be the person who had some guy do this terrible thing to you. And then in 2017-ish, right, that started to shift. And now it's more embarrassing and shameful to be the guy who did the thing than it is to be the person who had the thing done to them. Because what we found out through Me Too is that everybody has had stuff done to them, right? And so now we're thinking about men's behavior in a different way.
Yeah.
And when we see some bullshit, we're going to call it out and we're going to say something about it, right? And there's like this sliver of masculinity that is super threatened by that, right? Like when people are talking about like the patriarchy, right? They think they're talking about man and masculinity, and that's not. Those are different things, right? And I think someone who is truly a good guy, who's someone who's comfortable in their masculinity, can look at like problems like the big picture of like patriarchy has caused and say, yeah, that's messed up, right? Like there's some things that got to change. But there's other people who are super incredibly threatened by it. And so they target boys, and they do it through humor, they do it through memes, and jokes, and they're really sort of hard targeting like that middle school 13, 14, 15 year olds. And they're trying to get them to subscribe to these kind of ridiculous notions about, not masturbating and saving your seed, and calling women feminazis, like feminist is a bad word, that kind of thing. Like you don't want to be a feminist, right? Without explaining what that is, that kind of stuff. And I think kids are just really, really vulnerable to that.
Yes, all that. And I also see there's a very clever, as a marketer, right? There's a very clever insertion of language about dominance, language about consumerism, kind of clout, right? It's chasing after clout, chasing after prestige, chasing after expensive stuff, chasing after all of the consumer things. And then women end up getting put into that bucket of just another thing to be consumed.
Yep. Yep. Yeah. And yeah, I think boys are really kind of vulnerable to that, right? We don't have a lot of examples about what healthy masculinity looks like. We don't have conversations about that with boys. There's no other template that they have. And so these like good looking guys with like the biceps that they want and the cool cars come along and they say, this is how you get these things. And by the way, women are bitches or whatever, right? And they just kind of pepper that stuff in to that conversation, and boys kind of fall for it. The same way they kind of do with the porn. They think that that's what the reality is. Because there's not necessarily a lot of easily found information to counter that.
Yeah.
And guys like Andrew Tate and that whole group of guys, like they know this, right? They're doing it on purpose. And there's subtler people that do stuff that kind of go in through the side door, and they talk about a lot of things that are really kind of beneficial, and they talk about getting enough sleep and drinking this much water a day and blah blah blah. And by the way, if you masturbate, then you give away your masculine energy and women will take advantage of you. And they just sort of like tack that on at the end of this other like legit stuff. And then it's up to the 14-year-old to sort of like sift through all that and figure out like what's ridiculous and what is actual, and it's just really hard for them to do.
It's a very, very complex game of three truths and a lie, right? And that's the
Yeah, but the marketing, the influencers, they know, they understand that the game, they're doing it on purpose.
yeah. And and what kids maybe don't understand, and I remember having this conversation with my kids when they were quite a bit younger. They're kind of got wise to this. They've gotten enough media education to kind of see this now, but they didn't used to think that people were just trying to sell them things. Oh no, no,
Right.
it's not that. It's like, no, this is a real thing. This is good stuff. No, they're really just trying to sell you things. It's just about them making money.
And and that is even more, I think, easy to understand, or at least to develop muscles to be able to sort of find that on your radar, like for a television commercial. But when these influencers are in your face and they're not trying necessarily to sell you anything, they're just talking about how to live life and be like a real man, right? They're still selling it, but it doesn't cost anything. You don't have to put your credit card number in. But kids don't necessarily understand, like they're still selling me on this idea.
Yeah.
It's still just marketing. And even ones who do have some, media literacy, like they're not always able to extrapolate that into interpreting these influencers.
Yes, the complex world, which leads us directly, of course, right into a conversation about dopamine. So,
Sure.
what's different? What do you see, or do you see? Like, I've read there's a book called Dopamine Nation out there, and there's some pieces around how so much of our cultural information and cultural like way of being these days is just being manipulated all the time by dopamine hits, the dopamine cycle.
Yeah, I think both the combination of dopamine being somewhat misunderstood, and dopamine also being a real thing that we all deal with every single day, problematic, right? Because everything is just designed to get us to keep doing stuff that makes us happy, right? There's a reason on our iPhones that the symbol for how many messages you have is red and not green or something like that, right? Like there's a reason that Netflix just automatically starts that next video unless you tell it not to, right? Which even when you just think about in terms of like consent, right? It's just like it's these insidious little messages, that just keep people pushing and going forward in a kind of an autopilot sort of way, that ends up, I think, a lot of times not being very healthy. Um, Not sure if that's exactly what you were referencing,
That's
but like
good.
that's kind of
That's
when I'm talking to kids, like that's how it's coming up a lot.
And do you think that I don't like being alarmist about stuff, because there is alarmist stuff out there that's like the world is ending because of this. What do you think?
I'm not a fan of alarmist stuff either, although I do know that I'm a person who tends to freak people out. I actually have an apology slide when I do talks with parents because I say, I'm the person that freaks you out. I'm not trying to freak you out, but there's stuff that is going on that we need to talk about. And a lot of parents kind of walk away from listening to me talk going, oh shit, I didn't even know this was happening. Um, which is good. But in general, I'm not a fan of like the fear mongering or being alarmist about things. I think we have to be aware of stuff, and there's things that we got to do because the world is ending in certain ways, right? And the kids know that, right? Like Gen Z, particularly, they're aware of all the stuff, like particularly like climate stuff, gun control. Like they see it all, they know it all, they live it every day, and they understand, or they have a sense anyway that they understand that like the adults are not going to fix this for us. It's going to be up to us to do this. And I'm super proud of them. I'm excited for them. I think they're probably going to save us all. But the sense that a lot of kids have right now is that they have to fix all this stuff, and no one's going to help them. And it's really kind of heartbreaking in a lot of ways.
Thank you. I'm gonna start to wind us down with, just a tiny little question. Help us all stop freaking out about gender and pronouns.
All right. Wow, if I had the power to do that, that would be great. Um, I think that we are evolving. We're all evolving, right? Like we don't want to stay the same that we've been. We as a culture, as a society, as individual human people, like we want to keep growing and moving forward. And this is the way things are going. Like we're opening up how we're thinking about men, we're opening up how we think about women. Things are different, and that is okay. Gen Z is coming at this stuff with a lot of energy and thinking about things in a really healthy way. So a lot of the stuff that parents tend to be worrying about, like kids are thinking about gender in different ways or using different pronouns for themselves. Like kids don't care. They just go on with the world, right? Like that's how you identify. This is what you want to be called. Awesome. And then they just kind of keep walking. It's the adults that are coming at this stuff with all the energy and the angst and the stress. And we've done all of this before as as a society, as a culture, as a world. This is just the newest version of it, but it's going to be okay. We just have to ride the wave and get used to it. And now we don't think anything about there's how many men have shows on TV where they're chefs, right?
Hmm.
Like, and 40 years ago that was like just unheard of, right? Like that was not, men don't do that, women are the ones who cook, right? Even in the 90s that was still a thing, and we just don't even think twice about it anymore. And that's what we're going to be doing in 40 years with all the gender stuff, right? And guys wanting to, straight guys paint their fingernails, wear some lipstick. But and people kind of are sort of freaked out now. In 40 years we're not going to be thinking twice about it. It's just a thing. So try to wrap your brains around it, get on board, be one of the cool people who's been comfortable with it or acting like they're comfortable with it for 40 years, because there'll still be some people having a hard time with it then. I don't know what else to say about that. It's going to be okay. It's going to be okay.
It's going to be okay. Thank you. Yeah, rare shout out for my dad on the show. My dad is now 80, right? And he said something. We were talking about one of these incredibly politically charged issues, and he just said, "Can't they just understand that it doesn't affect you? Like,
right?
It's okay. Just, yeah, it is what it is, right?" And I love that. Thank you for that framing. Like, think about this from a long-term perspective. Think about this from the fact that culture has made radical, massive changes throughout time that we then just look back and say, oh, wow, it used to be like that. It's not like that anymore.
Yeah. And there's so many, I think that's one of the things that that I appreciate about Gen Z that I've learned from them, is that there's so many other big things happening in the world that we should be paying attention to and maybe staying up at night worrying about, right? That the fact that like the water off the coast of Florida has been 102 degrees, like hot tub water at the beaches in Florida. Like that stuff is important. And that's the stuff that kids are thinking about, not whether like little Johnny still wants to be called Johnny or thinks he's a boy or not thinks he's a boy. Like the kids are like, why is that even important to you? I don't care. He wants to be called Johnny, call him Johnny. I don't care about anything else beyond that. Like, can we talk about the ocean? Right? Like, there's just so many other important things happening right now.
Thank you. Very well said. So now, how do people go and get in touch with you and get your books?
So you mentioned the website, beheroes.net. My contact info is on there. I pride myself on being accessible, so people can reach out to me with questions. I love that. The book, there's links on the website, but anywhere you buy books, Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Bookstop is a great thing that a lot of people don't know about. Do you know Bookstop?
I don't.
um, uh, Bookshop. Sorry, did I say
Bookshop.
stop? Bookshop. Bookshop is great. It's very similar to Amazon, but they source all of the reading materials from small independent bookstores around America and maybe the world. And so it's on there as well. And so it's a nice kind of alternative to Amazon for getting books. But yeah, anywhere you can find the books, you can find them. I'm really proud of these updates. One of the big things about them was the languaging. So,
Right.
like I said, the the boy book was the first book for boys, and then I was asked to do a companion book for the girls, and but now the languaging is much more expanded. Speaking of what you were just talking
Yeah.
about,
Right.
right? It's boy identified people, and there's stuff in there for if you're a boy who has a penis, you should know this, and if you're a boy that doesn't have a penis, you should know that. So the languaging is a lot more expansive and inclusive and appropriate. I'm really sort of excited and proud about that. And lots of emotional management stuff that I folded into this round, and just kind of coming at personal safety and um, and sort of taking care of each other in a different way. I was able to kind of fold in a lot more information about those kinds of things in, and updated all the stats and everything too. So they're really and gorgeous. I have a new publisher, and I think they turned out really gorgeous.
Here we are. Thank you. So this has been Jo Langford. So I want you to go to his website, beheroes.net. Spare me the talk for boys or for girls, and the Pride Guide, the Guide to Sexual and Social Health for LGBTQ Youth by Jo Langford. Go get the books. Jo, thank you very much for spending time with me today and having this conversation.
Thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. And I personally want to thank our guests for joining us today and imparting their wisdom from their experiences in this amazing journey called life. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us. It happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.